Welcome to NovaraLIVE. Coming up tonight, Iran has rejected Trump's 15-point plan, which he says is a plan for peace. Of course, it's more a sham. We will also discuss, or I should say, I have a brilliant interview for you on what the West gets wrong about Iran and nuclear weapons, its nuclear program. That's an interview with Professor Sina Azodi, who's just written a brilliant book on this subject. And Americans don't seem to know anything about the country they're currently bombing. Is that a problem? I'm Micahel Walker. I'll be joined later this evening by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. As ever, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. Last night, the United States presented Iran with a 15-point proposal to end the war, which Trump and Netanyahu started. The plan, which was delivered to Iran via Pakistani intermediaries, calls on Iran to dismantle its three main nuclear sites, end any enrichment on Iranian soil, suspend its ballistic missile work, curb support for proxies, and fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Those are all quite big demands, essentially. In return, Iran would have nuclear-related sanctions lifted, and the US would offer some support for a civilian nuclear energy program. So the idea being that if Iran agreed to stop enriching uranium, other countries would provide them with the enriched uranium, which they could then use for civilian nuclear energy. The Iranians first hinted at their response via a statement from a military spokesperson. He said the strategic power you used to talk about has turned into a strategic failure. The one claiming to be a global superpower would have already gotten out of this mess if it could. Don't dress up your defeat as an agreement. Your era of empty promises has come to an end. Have your internal conflicts reached the point where you are negotiating with yourselves? We state this clearly. Until it is our will, nothing will go back to the way it was. That will only come about when the very thought of acting against the Iranian nation is completely wiped from your corrupt minds. Very strong words there. And this afternoon, Iranian State TV also quoted an official who communicated Iran's position. So the official, speaking to Press TV, said, Iran will end the war at a time of its own choosing, only if its own conditions are met, and Iran will not allow Donald Trump to dictate the timing of the war's end. This official, speaking to Press TV, also communicated 5 conditions for ending the war. So this is via Press TV. Iran demands an end to aggression by the enemy. Iran demands establishment of concrete guarantees preventing the recurrence of war. Iran demands clear determination, guaranteed payment of war damages and compensation. Iran demands comprehensive end to the war across all fronts, including against all resistance groups. That would be sort of Hezbollah and the Houthis, perhaps. And Iran demands recognition of Tehran's sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz as its natural legal right. Now, I was very surprised that those bullet points put out by Press TV, so again, not an official document, but you know, it's the state TV channel, which said these were the 5 conditions, didn't include really a mention of sanctions or Iran's right to enrich uranium. And my understanding was the right to enrich uranium was a real red line for the Iranians. They could do that under Obama's deal. The Israelis didn't want them to do any kind of enrichment, and that was, I think, one of the reasons why the talks with the Trump administration broke down, because the Trump administration couldn't decide if it wanted the very hard lines of the Israelis or more of an Obama vision. I have an interview later in the show with an expert who explains what he thinks with these 5 demands. I suppose a clue. He thinks that actually enrichment is still a red line, but we'll come to that later. More immediately, the risk Iran's leaders will be assassinated is standing in the way of high-level negotiations taking place. So this is from a Financial Times report today. So they wrote, Saeed Leilaz, an Iranian analyst, said the suspicion in Tehran was that Trump was either seeking a ceasefire or attempting another act of deception, which could even involve trying to draw Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, one of the Republic's top wartime leaders, into the open to assassinate him. Like other senior leaders, Ghalibaf, who is close to Khamenei and the Guards, has not appeared in public since the first days of the war. After Trump claimed his envoys had been in touch with a top person in Iran, some media reports speculated it was Ghalibaf. The Iranian politicians retorted that no negotiations had taken place. And then it says Iran expert Ali Vaiz said Ghalibaf was, quote, not going to take the risk of exposing himself just to have a conversation with people who have bombed Iran twice in the middle of negotiations. And they say 2 diplomats briefed on the talk said communications within the upper echelons of the Republic were being complicated by fears that either the US or Israel could trace calls in order to locate and target senior officials. So, I mean, this is the situation the Americans have got themselves in, and the Israelis, of course. So the Israelis don't seem to mind, which is that there's absolutely no one to negotiate with, because all of Iran's leadership, quite understandably, believe that if they let the Israelis or the Americans know where they are, if they let the Americans know where they are, the Israelis will obviously find out, they will just get assassinated. And what makes it even worse, this is the point I hadn't quite grasped myself, is they don't even really want to communicate via electronic means, because they're worried that the Americans or the Israelis will then be able to trace the calls and then kill them that way. So they sort of, the Americans and Israelis have constructed a situation, I think the Israelis on purpose, the Americans perhaps by accident, where it's almost physically impossible to have a meaningful negotiation with Iran. If Iranian leaders are worried that the Americans are only interested in killing them, taking them out, this comment by Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, will not have reassured them.
We see ourselves as part of this negotiation as well. We negotiate with bombs. You have a choice as we loiter over the top of Tehran, as the president talked about your future. The president has made it clear that you will not have a nuclear weapon. The War Department agrees. Our job is to ensure that. And so we're keeping our hand on that throttle as long as hard as is necessary.
Lots of people on the internet were commenting on Trump's raised eyebrows as he discussed the long, hard throttle. I mean, the broader issue there is that, that's morally disgusting, the idea we'll negotiate with bombs. Also, completely implausible, right? The argument that's been put forward by experts like Robert Pape since the start of this war is that airwaves are rarely a way to achieve any kind of compromise, right? That's because if they do change the politics of the country being bombed, it's not to make it more moderate, it's to radicalize it, right? You don't bomb a country, kill a load of people, and then they say, okay, maybe it is time to negotiate, especially if you keep killing their leaders. That line of reasoning, saying this is not a strategy that's going to work, appears to be shared by Danny Citrinovich, who was formerly head of the Iran research branch in the Israeli Defense Intelligence. So he tweeted, "This is yet another piece of evidence that Washington still doesn't understand the shift Iran has gone through during the war. The regime today is more radical, less centralized, and increasingly convinced that it is winning, which means it believes it can dictate the terms of how this conflict ends. That leaves Trump with 2 real options: either de facto surrender a ceasefire without a deal, or an agreement shaped around Iran's demands, or a major escalation with severe consequences for the global system and the international economy. This is the direct result of a campaign built on flawed assumptions, especially a fundamental misreading of Iran's resilience. Iran is not Venezuela. There is no Delcy Rodriguez waiting in Tehran, and there is no silver bullet for the Iran problem, period." So he's essentially saying Iran will either agree to a deal on its own terms, or I suppose he's saying there's 2 outcomes. One, there's a deal which is favorable to Iran, or there's a ground invasion. Now, I hope the Americans agree to a deal which is favorable to Iran. But, unless Trump can dress that up as victory, you do have to worry about a ground invasion. And in terms of the possibility for that happening, CNN today had this worrying report.
Well, Audie, whatever the president ultimately decides about a ground operation in Iran, all the pieces are now in the region to carry one out. And it's not just the 1,000 paratroopers. You have Marines deployed to the region, and then all the forces, the air transport, et cetera, that one would require to put troops on the ground, whether that be, you've heard the discussion of Karg Island, which is so central to Iran's energy industry, or perhaps along the shores of the Strait of Hormuz to secure the Strait of Hormuz. We don't know, and ultimately it's up to the president, but at least the pieces are in place. So we're left in a situation not unlike where we were 4 weeks ago before the start of the war, where you have 2 tracks at the same time. You have diplomatic discussions with Iran, or at least now laying the groundwork for those discussions, with an enormous military buildup. We saw what happened 4 weeks ago. The president chose the military option, saying that the talks weren't going anywhere. So we're left in that situation again. Will the president decide that the talks aren't going anywhere in his view, and then deploy further military action up to and including ground forces? We don't know. I will tell you from here in Israel, there's a great deal of skepticism as to whether there is actual potential for real peace negotiations.
It is a really strange situation because, basically the argument being put forward there is that this could be, and I think Pete Hegseth has said as much, which is that by amassing these troops on the border of Iran, what they're trying to do is just increase their leverage when it comes to negotiating with Iran. But at the same time, they're saying to the American people, don't worry, this is not going to turn into a quagmire. This is not going to be the next Iraq. This is not going to be the next Afghanistan. Obviously, if they do a ground invasion, then it immediately is the next Iraq, right? There's no two ways about it. That is what's going to happen. So I don't understand why the Iranians are supposed to suddenly be scared of this prospect. Now, don't get me wrong. I think if there were a ground invasion, that would be disastrous for the people of Iran. But the Iranian regime at the moment don't seem inclined to give up easily on their red lines, which, as I've said, appears to be they want to be able to enrich uranium and have some sanctions relief, in part to try and defend themselves against an invasion that might happen in a year's time by the Israelis and the Americans again. So I don't think amassing a few thousand troops on the border of Iran is going to force the kind of compromise that the Americans, are still publicly maintaining they can achieve. I don't know if they actually, believe it in their heart of hearts. And of course, one reason the Iranians appear in no rush to end this war is the emerging consensus that they're winning. So this is going to show you a clip, not of some tanky who hates the American military and thinks the Islamic Republic is, this brilliant anti-imperialist front that's going to become a world hegemon. No, this is the former head of the MI6. He's called Sir Alex Younger, speaking to The Economist.
I think what people are struggling with, what I'm struggling with, is a full understanding of who has the upper hand right now, who is in a stronger position as that process unfolds.
Iran. I think, and I regret having come to this conclusion because, like many MI6 officers of my generation, we faced the violence and brutality of the IRGC for most of our careers.
Just the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps.
Yeah, so there is no love lost between us. And I shed no tears for Ali Khamenei, who was killed at the beginning of this war. But the reality is that the US underestimated the task and I think, as of about 2 weeks ago, lost the initiative to Iran. In practice, the Iranian regime has been more resilient than I think anyone would have expected. They took some good decisions, actually, as early as last June about dispersing their military capability and delegating the authority for the use of those weapons, which has given them significant extra resilience against this incredibly powerful air campaign.
So a lot of ideological effort went into sort of before this war, arguing that the Iranian regime was a paper tiger, it would collapse the moment it was pushed, that they're completely irrational, right? That I go on to this in my interview later on, but the reason they can't have a nuclear weapon is because they're, countries like America, Russia, China, they're rational. They use game theory. The Iranians, they're mad. Right, they just want to. They're sort of suicidal. They just want to cause as much damage as possible, and you can't really make heads or tails of what they're doing. They're the mad mullahs. And then you've got the head of the MI6 saying, to be fair to them, they've planned this excellently. We severely underestimated them. Oh, and by the way, they're winning the war. Before we go on to our next section and that interview, it seems today, this is unusual. We don't normally get to clear up confusions that have come from Donald Trump's mouth, but you may have seen yesterday Donald Trump saying this at his White House press conference.
Because they're going to make a deal. They're going to make a deal. They did something yesterday that was amazing, actually. They gave us a present, and the present arrived today. And it was a very big present worth a tremendous amount of money. And I'm not going to tell you what that present is, but it was a very significant prize. And they gave it to us, and they said they were going to give it. So that meant one thing to me: we're dealing with the right people.
Is that nuclear related?
No, it wasn't nuclear related. It was oil and gas related, and it was a very nice thing they did. But what it showed me is that we're dealing with the right people.
So that led to lots of speculation. And a secret present, was it a wooden horse? Was it a pager, like the Israelis gave to Hezbollah? We do now know, though. So according to the Times of Israel, the present was, in fact, that Iran allowed the safe passage of a number of fuel tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. So they say the US officials tell the Times of Israel that when the Trump administration began passing along messages to Iran through mediators over the weekend in order to test whether a diplomatic off-ramp to the war was possible, it asked Tehran to make a gesture of goodwill. In response, Iran agreed to allow a number of fuel tankers that weren't tied to the US or Israel through the Strait of Hormuz in order to help calm global markets, the Arab official says. The Arab official acknowledges that the safe passage of a small number of tankers is not likely to have a significant or long-term impact on global oil prices, a concession that Iran is not yet prepared to offer while US and Israeli strikes continue. The limited impact of the present explains why Trump avoids specifying exactly what it was, the Arab official says. So it was a bit of a meaningless present, which is why Donald Trump didn't want to let anyone know. Obviously, there's no reason why them letting through an oil tank. There's nothing classified about that, is there? So it seems more likely the case that Donald Trump thought if he went public with that, some journalists might point out that not really a very big deal. The reason we're told that the US and Israel are bombing Iran is to stop it getting a nuclear weapon.
This terrorist regime can never have a nuclear weapon. I'll say it again. They can never have a nuclear weapon. They're violent people. If they had a nuclear weapon, they would use it. We're not giving a nuclear weapon to terrorist thugs, and we're knocking the hell out of them.
Those are all clips of Trump from over the past 3 weeks since he launched his war against Iran. And of course, Benjamin Netanyahu has famously been warning Iran will imminently have a nuclear weapon for over 3 decades. I mean, in fact, nearly all of the Western politicians and powers agree that Iran should not be allowed to get nuclear weapons. The disagreement is just on the method to stop it happening. So you might remember, Obama applied harsh sanctions on Iran and then lifted them in exchange for a promise that Iran would limit its nuclear enrichment.
With this deal, we cut off every single one of Iran's pathways to a nuclear program, a nuclear weapons program. And Iran's nuclear program will be under severe limits for many years. Without a deal, those pathways remain open. There would be no limits to Iran's nuclear program, and Iran could move closer to a nuclear bomb.
Trump opposed that nuclear deal before he was president.
I've been doing deals for a long time. I've been making lots of wonderful deals, great deals. That's what I do. Never, ever, ever in my life have I seen any transaction so incompetently negotiated as our deal with Iran. And I mean never.
Now, when Donald Trump entered the White House, he ripped that deal up, and now we are where we are. Without the deal, Iran continued enriching their uranium, and now the Israelis and the Americans are in a pointless war against the country. That narrative has been well told. In the West, we're used to looking at the politics of Iran's nuclear ambitions through the lens of people like Obama, Trump, and Netanyahu. Very rarely, though, are we told to consider the perspective of Iran. Now, that to me seems like it might be quite relevant, right? Do we ever ask, why does Iran want to have a nuclear program? Now, that's a question addressed in a new book by Professor Sina Azodi. He's, as I say, assistant professor and director of Middle East Studies at George Washington University. So it's called Iran and the Bomb. It traces the evolution of Iran's nuclear strategy from the 1950s to today. And Professor Azodi was kind enough to join me on Novara Media, and I began by asking him what he thinks the West gets wrong about Iran's nuclear ambitions.
A lot of things. First of all, I think in terms of the objectives or the drivers of the program, the first thing is that Iranians want to have the option of producing nuclear weapons, not necessarily the actual arsenal. So that's the first thing that they get wrong. Second, it's the rather Orientalist arguments that if Iranians get the bomb because they're old, clergy men from the Middle East, they're crazy, deterrence doesn't apply to them, and somehow they want to bring the end of the world, so they're going to launch on other countries that have nuclear weapons. That assumption is incorrect. I've been working on this topic for a very long time, and that is not the case. They're very much their understanding of international politics might be different from us, but they're not crazy and they're not suicidal. That's another one. And thirdly, I think something that I've noticed is this. Again, it's kind of an imperialistic approach that some people in the West would tell Iranians that you don't need, and the word need is the emphasis here, that you don't need nuclear energy because you have oil and gas. But this is not how Iranians think. I think for a country that has, 5,000 years of civilization, they are in a better position to determine what they need with their nuclear program.
Let's take those 3 points in turn then. So I suppose the first one can be called the threshold strategy, right? So Iran has wanted to be at the threshold of creating a nuclear weapon, so have the capacity to enrich uranium, but not go as far as converting it into a bomb. Now, for many people, that's kind of confusing because it looks like you're attracting all the problems of nuclear weapons, international isolation, and obviously that's the excuse that the Americans and the Israelis have put forward for this war, yet you don't yet have the deterrence. So you can't deter invasion while you also motivate invasion. So is it as bizarre a strategy as it sounds, or how can you make that make sense to me and our audience here?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, and this is it was a suboptimal decision-making by Iranians, meaning that, and I want to go back a little bit, when I say a little bit, 50 years ago, when the Shah of Iran also pursued the same strategy of hedging. Back then, they called it a surge capacity, in the words of the Shah's foreign minister and son-in-law, the late Ardeshir Zahedi. He also argued, and I've seen documents, that the Shah and his military were working on nuclear weapons. I've seen those documents. And the Islamic Republic pursued identical policies. The problem, though, is that they overplayed the card of enrichment. They overplayed the enrichment capacity way too much, meaning that they thought that they could get concessions from the West by expanding the nuclear program without actually getting the bomb. But that backfired. And we saw this in 2021 when they thought that a rapid expansion of the program and enriching to 60%, something they called poking the U.S. in the eye, would bring them benefits. But as you pointed out, it actually brought or invited a military intervention without Iranians being able to use the benefits of a nuclear arsenal.
On that second point, you say, and I completely agree with you, that the West is always saying, oh, if Iran has nuclear weapons, these are mad mullahs, this is a sort of genocide or irrational regime, so mutually assured destruction won't work for them because they don't care if their own country gets blown up. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me. It seems racist to me, frankly. At the same time, I suppose it's a bit of a gift to the Israelis and the Americans that the Iranian leadership has, chanted death to America, death to Israel. It's quite easy to make an Israeli or American population fearful of the idea of Iranians having nuclear weapons.
I mean, look, Iranians can chant, I condemn it, they shouldn't. Israel is a member of the UN, so is the US or Iran. But they can chant death to this or death to that until their faces turn blue. But does Iran have the capacity to do so? And the answer is no. And even with nuclear weapons, and again, I've looked at so many documents of the internal debates in Iran, starting from the Shah's time, that the reason that the Shah didn't actually weaponize was that he thought that nuclear weapons would not deter the Soviets. And his words were, even if we get 50 nuclear warheads, what are we going to do with 5,000 nuclear warheads? That was his thinking. And the Islamic Republic, exactly, the leadership of the Islamic Republic had come to the same conclusions, that they cannot deter the United States. Now, in terms of those, and I agree with you, racist remarks, the idea, actually, the first, it's not just some, policymaker in the U.S. I've seen scholars, well-known scholars, who have argued that Iran would launch on Israel. Namely, I could point out to the late historian Bernard Lewis, who wrote on August 8th, 2006, that on August 22nd, 2006, Iran would launch a nuclear first strike on Israel. And why August 22nd, 2006? Because it was the anniversary of the reported trip of the Prophet of Islam, his ascendance to the heavens. And they thought that this would be, he argued that for Iranians, because they're driven by messianic approaches or worldviews, they will launch on Israel. And that hasn't happened. And I hope it never happens. And I don't think that Iran, or rather any country, would use their nuclear weapons for offensive purposes.
Third point you mentioned, the third misunderstanding is when people in the West say Iran doesn't need nuclear energy because it's got so much oil. I suppose, I agree any country should be able to have a civilian nuclear capacity if they want. From looking at the documents, though, is the reason Iran is committed to having nuclear energy because of energy, or is it really because they want to be at a nuclear threshold? Is the energy for sort of everyone a bit of a distraction, and this is actually about deterrence?
Again, excellent question. I think both arguments are correct. And again, I want to go back to 1970s when the Shah of Iran thought that oil, what he called it, a noble good, and Iran should not burn oil for fuel, that Iran needs to preserve that for its economic development and rather use nuclear energy to sustain, and produce, to generate power. Now, back then, the US, West Germany, and all these Western nations that had nuclear technology hailed the Shah's intentions. And there's a famous Stanford report that said that this is how much energy Iran needs by 1990s, and nuclear energy is the best approach to it. And everybody would line up to sell Iran very expensive nuclear reactors. It is after the revolution that the attitude changed, and you have the very same people who said that, or hailed the Shah's nuclear energy program, that they said, oh, Iran has oil and gas. And Iranian leadership by late 1980s, early 1990s had come to the same conclusions that the government of the Shah had arrived, meaning that they also thought that Iran's oil will at some point will run out, and to sustain Iran's economic development, they need to find alternative paths to generate power. Now, for Iranians, having the nuclear energy, having enrichment capacity, in the words of an Iranian scientist that I spoke to, was their moon landing, that this symbolized Iran's technological advancement, modernization, et cetera, et cetera. So all of those can be true at the same time. That is, they needed the energy, at least they believed that they needed the energy. It was also their modernization, their moon landing, if you will, plus the benefits of, again, at least supposedly, the benefits of being at the threshold status.
I want to fast forward us up right to today, actually the last 24 hours. So Donald Trump put forward this 15-point plan, which included that there would be no enrichment of uranium inside Iran. And from my understanding, that was sort of a red line. Iran sees it as its sovereign right to enrich uranium within the country, even if not to create a nuclear weapon. Iran, in the past couple of hours, has rejected that plan. But according to Press TV, their sort of 5 red lines didn't even mention the nuclear issue, which I was quite surprised about. Iran demands end to aggression by the enemy. Iran demands establishment of concrete guarantees preventing the recurrence of war. Iran demands clear determination, guaranteed payment of war damages, compensation. Iran demands comprehensive end to the war across all fronts, including against all resistance groups. And Iran demands recognition of Tehran's sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. This was put out by Press TV, sort of, they said via an official. Everyone is sort of talking about this now as Iran's 5 conditions for ending the war. Should we read too much into the fact that hasn't sort of explicitly said that the ability and right to enrich uranium within Iran is a red line?
It is. I believe it is the brightest red line. And again, I want to go back to history because I think history is always instructive. Even under the Shah, they had plans to enrich uranium, but Iran's capacity back then was not advanced enough, so they couldn't. But they had plans to import enrichment by 1980s, and I think that Iranians would agree to any limitations on enrichment, but they're not going to give up the principle of enrichment on Iranian soil. This is what they believe they achieved by their own scientific advancement. They think it's a sovereign right. They believe their legal interpretation of the NPT is that it is enshrined. Well, now, I mean, it's subject to legal debate whether it is or it is not, but from their interpretation of Article 4 of the NPT is that they have the right to enrich. So this is why they won't negotiate, especially at the time where they've endured 2 decades of sanctions. They've fought 2 wars over enrichment. So it would be extremely difficult to any Iranian policymaker to sell that domestically and say, okay, fine, now that we've been hit and we've been bruised by the Americans and the Israelis, all right, fine, we'll give up. I don't think it will happen.
Yeah, so these 5 points that have been put out, do you think that's maybe misleading? Maybe, we're supposed to read in between the lines. I was just very surprised not to see it as one of the 5.
I think my sense is that they're just saying that we're not going to even negotiate over the enrichment capacity, and our red lines are that we're not going to. I think the main red line in that proposal is that the guarantee that war will not happen, because since the end of the June 2025 conflict, the 12-day war, Iranians operated under the assumption that this ceasefire is not stable, is not going to hold that long, and there's going to be a second round of fighting. So this is why, and even during the talks that they had with the Americans, they had requested a guarantee that war will not be started as the talks were happening, which we saw that didn't happen.
I know your book sort of covers the history of the question of Iran and the bomb and its relationship with the United States. I suppose a key moment in recent history was the Obama deal. I think most people agree one of the big reasons this war is happening now is because Donald Trump ripped up that deal. So I wonder if you could just sort of briefly explain what the Obama deal was and why, from the Iranian perspective, it was worth signing.
Well, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran deal, in very simple terms, was a transaction that, in return for nuclear restraint and intrusive inspections, and in the words of the former director of IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, Yukio Amano, JCPOA had the most intrusive inspection mechanism in the world. So there was no way for Iran to be able to sneak out or develop materials needed for nuclear weapons. And in return, what Iran wanted was trade, commerce, and investments, and desecuritization of Iranian nuclear program at the Security Council. And they achieved it. And Iran was implementing it. I think I counted 11 consecutive reports that Iranians were implementing the deal. And I think, to President Obama's credit, he understood, and Europeans before him had understood, including the Brits and the French, that without some enrichment capacity in Iran, Iranians are not going to agree to any deal. And Obama realized this, and he played that enrichment card. He said, fine, we determine how much enrichment capacity you need inside the country, and then we can negotiate the scale of it, how many centrifuges you can operate, and in return for sanctions relief and investment. This is why it worked well. Why? Because, and I've looked at the memoirs of Iranian negotiators, for them it was really the recognition that by the United States and the West, the very same countries that refused to transfer nuclear technology to Iran, that the country can enrich uranium on its soil. For them, it was a matter of status, that they are being treated as an equal partner and not with a condescending attitude that Donald Trump administration has had.
Uranium could be enriched up to a purity of 3.67%. The level needed for a weapon is around 90%. I think Iran is currently at 60%, right? So after Trump ripped up the deal, they did start enriching to get closer to a weapon. And
that's correct. So in 2018, when Donald Trump violated the agreement, and ironically, everybody in the U.S. and I looked at all the discussions in D.C. that everybody said it will be Iranians who will cheat. Iranians are not trustworthy. You cannot negotiate with them because they're going to cheat on the agreement. They implemented it. Donald Trump violated that agreement. Iranians stayed in the deal for a year, but when the Europeans could not deliver the promises or the trade benefits of the JCPOA, that's when Iranians steadily, step by step, violated the JCPOA.
That was Professor Sina Azodi speaking to me earlier today. And we'll be putting out the full conversation this evening or tomorrow. Very, very interesting. Sort of towards the end of the conversation, we discussed what might happen next and what Sina Azodi thinks could be the result of this war. I suppose a bit of a clue. He seems to think it's pretty goddamn likely that Iran will get a nuclear bomb in the next few years. Although he doesn't necessarily think that that's as catastrophic as we're often told, because many countries have nuclear bombs and countries with nuclear bombs don't tend to just use them, right? But if you're interested in that question, do check out the rest of that interview. For now, I'm joined by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. You've had some difficult experiences on Britain's train network.
Yes, another privatization success story.
Although my partner's been doing a tour for his book in Germany, and their trains are nationalised, and he says they're even worse.
Even worse, German efficiency, raw German efficiency.
No, apparently Germany is not nearly as efficient as we're made out to believe. Of course,
propaganda. I've been caught out by propaganda.
France and Spain do have nationalised railways, and theirs are brilliant. So obviously, Germany's nationalised railway is not an argument against nationalisation, but nationalisation isn't necessarily a silver bullet. You can have a bad nationalised rail service. Before we get too distracted by this, because you weren't here for that first segment, I suppose your thoughts on what's happened over the last 24 hours. Were you particularly surprised that Iran don't seem interested in Donald Trump's 15-point plan?
I mean, obviously, I wouldn't be surprised in the specific nature of the fact that they don't seem interested in the plan as it's laid out by Donald Trump, right? Why would you take Donald Trump seriously in negotiations, given what we've seen so far, given what we saw with regards to Venezuela as well, in terms of the negotiating tactics of Donald Trump, right? But in terms of the broader approach of Iran of not wanting the war necessarily to end, at least not at this instant, at least not with the way in which it's being presented politically by the Trump administration, I mean, I think it makes sense broadly from the position, as you mentioned in the piece, that Iran does seem to be winning this war. At least if they're not winning it militarily, they're certainly winning it politically, because they have no reason to end the war, because they are obviously more concerned with the geopolitics than the United States is. There's a geopolitical interest that Iran has that the US really don't have. They are in this war because they were dragged into it by Israel and Netanyahu. That was the foremost concern of the American administration, on top of the fact that Trump wanted his own version of the Iran deal, again, that he had ripped up, purely seems to be on the grounds of the fact that he wanted his name on it, rather than concerns over what was in the deal itself, a deal, as you say, which Israel didn't like themselves, so we can see Trump being dragged into this broadly without having any concerns of his own in terms of what's happening in this war. But there are political concerns that the Trump administration has that the Iranian regime doesn't have to have, right? In terms of the fact that there is a democratic deficit internally in America, which we're seeing, that broadly people don't want to enter this war. They didn't want to be in the war in the first place. It's causing, whilst it is definitely causing concern for the citizens of Iran, I don't think the Ayatollah really has any concerns with that, because that is a dictatorship, right? There is a political concern for the Trump administration because they will lose midterms. They will lose the next general election if they do not find some way of able to turning this around to be a successful project for them, which it clearly isn't, which is why they've put out a plan which says something like, well, do all of these things that make me look like the victor in the eyes of the public, rather than what is the concern of necessarily the Trump administration themselves. So there are obviously, the longer that Iran hold out on this, the more gas prices go up in the United States, the more they see inflation hit, the more we even see the rumors that this will collapse the stock market. It could even kill the AI boom if access to energy, which is broadly the absolute fulcrum on which the future AI economy depends upon, if that is made even more expensive, that could see a stock market crash, which will hit the broader American economy and be even worse politically for Trump. So Iran holds all those economic cards as well as the fact that any escalation of the conflict probably works in Iran's favor too, because if there's a boots on the ground invasion, again, politically bad for the Trump administration. It shows that the fact that they thought they could do a Venezuela, just get rid of the leader, do some new installation, then negotiate from there, didn't work in this instance, I guess mostly because Iran, given their topography, given the size, given the military investment they've done up to this point, and all of the preparation and training that they had. They have understudies for each government position. They have a decentralized form of the IRGC, as we're seeing now, able to police the country even when they do see their supreme leader get executed by the United States, meaning that they have more to gain if there was a ground invasion by America than America have to gain, because that would be catastrophic for them in terms of being pulled into the quagmire. And there's another part of this too, which is that Iran can see that this is turning European countries away from the United States. This war has been terrible for Trump-European negotiations and relationships. We even saw Syed Abbas Araghchi tweeting out, explicitly making a statement, the British people don't want this war, the British people will see that they're being dragged in if we start striking UK bases because they've been allowed to launch US bombers. There's a very clear campaign that they want to ensure that this link is severed. They don't want Europeans in the war, obviously that's why they're tweeting these things and why they're putting out these statements. But they also want to ensure that the link between America and Europe is broken, because that makes America even more isolated in this conflict.
The thing about the nuclear negotiations and Trump ripping up the Obama deal, and funny is the wrong word because the outcome has been so catastrophic, but he ripped it up because he said we're giving them money and they might still sort of create nuclear weapons, and it's a terrible deal, and so it gets ripped up. But then he goes and negotiates with North Korea, because if you remember when Trump first became president, the end of the Obama administration, apparently Obama told Trump, the biggest problem in your in tray is that North Korea are on the threshold of a nuclear weapon. You need to do something to sort that out. Trump sort of just decided, I'm going to make friends with the North Korean leader. He seems like a cool, powerful guy. He went there, made some kind of deal, and North Korea got nuclear weapons. So the Obama deal did actually stop Iran getting nuclear weapons, and he ripped it up. And then he went and made a deal with the North Koreans that meant they got a nuclear weapon. So, clearly his problem is not nuclear weapons. His problem is that Israel opposed the Iran deal and it had Obama's name on it. The other thing I find instructive about North Korea is, when they're on the threshold of getting the nuclear weapon, it was talked about like this was, the biggest crisis in the world. If it happens, they're so crazy they'll use it. These North Koreans, they're mad. They're not like other countries. And, I don't like the North Korean regime, right? It seems very oppressive. It seems like, I would much prefer to live in South Korea. Let's put it like that. I think they have harnessed the talent of their people and the potential of their nation and their population much better than they have in North Korea. So I'm pro South Korea when it comes to what I want my society to look like. But the idea that these states, even if you don't like how they're run, are going to just be mad, megalomaniac, suicidal, we can't be constrained by mutually assured destruction because we don't think like you people. The idea was the moment North Korea gets a bomb, we're all screwed because they're going to start this nuclear apocalypse. And when countries get nuclear bombs, they don't, it's not normally a catastrophe. Like, do I want a world where every country has a nuclear bomb? Like, not really, just because the more countries that have a nuclear bomb, the more likely there is to be an accidental nuclear war. But this idea that there are rational countries and crazy countries, which I think is how it's often spoken about in the West.
To be fair, we probably do have a case where there are some rational countries and some irrational countries, and the irrational countries are Israel and the United States. These are the ones who are engaging in global, economically catastrophic conflicts for ideological ends. This is an ideological end that Israel is fighting upon. America are following them in because it is run by ideological Zionists, right? People who are indelibly linked into not just the Israeli regime currently, but Israeli Israeli statecraft, right? But again, we have people with the links like Lindsey Graham going directly to Netanyahu as a go-between to try and get him to convince Trump to be involved in this because of his ideological predisposition towards the state of Israel and towards Zionism, which is why they're engaging in, as I say, globally catastrophic conflict. If I could name any country in the world I thought would use a first strike nuclear weapon, I would, without a doubt, say it's the Trump administration who would use a tactical nuclear weapon, in my mind, to avoid political humiliation. Because that's one thing that Trump fears the most.
Probably not against a nuclear-armed power. They're still, the point I'm making is they're still constrained by MAD, mutually assured destruction.
Yeah,
I think that I don't think. Well, I think Netanyahu is in many ways rational. I just think his project is a fairly fascistic one of a greater Israel.
Yeah,
Trump
fair.
Probably isn't particularly rational. Trump is quite mad. But I don't think America and Israel are unique, sort of in how they conduct foreign policy. The uniqueness there is the combination of enormous power and sort of ideological drive. I think there are lots of countries in the world which are just as ideological as the Americans and even the Israelis. They just don't have the capacity. But I think what people argue about Iran and North Korea is that they're uniquely ideological in the sense that they wouldn't mind if they were bombed. They wouldn't mind if they were nuclear, if their people were just destroyed under a sort of nuclear cloud, and therefore they'll bomb anyone, and the moment they get a bomb, we're all screwed. The United States is currently trying to bomb a country of 90 million people into submission, but many Americans have no idea where that country is. This Fox News report, speaking to students on spring break, has gone viral.
What have you heard that Donald Trump has been doing recently?
Gulf of America. That's the last thing I kept up with. We're going to war with Iraq. That's been crazy.
What do you do in Colombia? You got Maduro out?
I don't with Trump, but that done.
He's like trying to sue those people for making jokes about him.
600 times! You must be happy.
I'm very happy.
The Ayatollah's dead.
What? Who? What? What is that?
Who the is Ayatollah?
I've never heard that word in my life.
Lewis, what's Ayatollah?
I haven't heard. I found out about Chuck Norris yesterday. That was more devastating to me.
He was the supreme leader of Iran.
He's dead? Oh, yeah.
We killed him. You did? You killed him?
Johnny.
Whoa. If you were in charge, how would you take on Iran?
Yeah, all my girls and we would all start putting belts on them.
We get a bunch of girls in bikinis, we make them run across the battlefield. All the guys are distracted, we all run in.
Look at him in his eyes, I guess. Flirt with him.
I'd blow him up.
I don't know enough about it, but I would probably wipe it out.
Drop a bomb, baby. Bomb the out of him.
I would bomb the out of him.
What have you heard about Venezuela?
Venezuela? Nothing.
I'm not sure. I barely know what'll be going on in like Tennessee where I'm from.
That they beat us in the World Baseball Classic. Have you heard anything else? No.
Nothing. I haven't heard nothing about Venezuela.
You know, honestly, I don't know and I don't care.
Where is Venezuela?
I don't know. I'm drunk. I don't know. Venezuela? Isn't that in Spain?
Now, I have to put my cards on the table. Until, the guy who said, I want to wipe them out or bomb the shit out of them, even though, I mean, the president said, the bigger problem is that the president said that, not that person on the beach said it. But until they said that, I'm quite into people having a good time and not following politics. I think, if anything, people potentially, this is a strange thing for someone who hosts a politics show to say, but I feel like maybe people think too much about politics. There's too much competition to make you angry about this or that and that, and I think maybe it's making society miserable. So people having a good time, getting drunk on the beach, having sex with each other, I'm fine with that. But yeah, don't then sort of say, let's just bomb them, and hopefully they didn't vote for Trump. There have, though, been very reasonable objections online, which I do take quite seriously, of people saying that scene was quite troubling. So Ishan Faror is a Washington Post columnist who said this: having just seen long lines for cooking gas cylinders on the streets of cities in India, one of many bystanders to the conflict whose population has been seriously impacted, I'm struck yet again by how relatively insulated the US is from the wars it unleashes. I think there's absolutely a lot to that. Obviously, if you're in Iran at the moment, you don't have the privilege of being unaware of the war that the Americans are conducting on your country. This was the take from Thomas Chatterton Williams, who writes for The Atlantic. He said, a lot of the problems in the world right now can be explained by this video. For one thing, it's a big reason why the US government is so unaccountable to public opinion. These are college students. A significant amount of the country is totally checked out and comfortable enough not to think it matters. I think I think I take Isham Farour's point more seriously than Thomas Chatterton Williams's point, because I think the bigger problem here is that the country conducting the war is relatively insulated from its consequences, whereas Thomas Chatterton Williams' point is that people aren't paying enough attention to politics. I think maybe that's always been the case, and often when lots of these people, if they became more sort of proactively engaged in politics, they might just become even more right-wing and want to vote for Trump and get down a Tucker Carlson conspiracy theory. I don't think the idea that if the one thing we want people to do is get really, really engaged in politics and then everything will be okay, I don't necessarily subscribe to that. But I want to know, what was your reaction to that video, which I think has been viewed about 8 million times now on Twitter, partly because it's very entertaining?
I mean, I think I share your opinion that, I'm quite jealous, really. People who have checked out of politics, people who don't have to continually stare down the barrel of genocides being committed on the other side of the world and realise that we are all empty husks at the end of the day. But, I mean, yeah, I agree that I think that it's a really kind of great microcosm of just how insulated you get by being in the imperial core, right? These are people who don't have to worry about the concerns of geopolitics because of the level that being a member of the imperial core grants them the level they don't have to care. There's a reason why 9/11 is so kind of indelibly inked into the American consciousness, because it was the first time really for huge numbers of people in the United States they had to confront the realities of geopolitics. It was the first time they had to confront it. It wasn't something that happened elsewhere. It was something that was happening on their doorstep in their cities, right? Because, thousands of people died. It was a tragic event, right? These things happen every single day in countries in the global south, whether that be at the hands of American imperialism or at the hands of global conflict or the hands of broader destabilization in these regions that has, myriad factors going into them, and we see that from the way in which America reacted. They reacted by, doing what they do best, which is blowing up countries in the global south. We saw that because it was a way that they needed to show that they weren't weak anymore in the wake of 9/11. And what we've also seen in terms of the level to which people are checked out of politics, I think first of all, we've seen broadly democratic participation go down. I mean, one interesting fact I remember somebody pointed out after the 2020 election, because that was at a really kind of weirdly high turnout. It's the only election we've seen in 30 years or so where the winning candidate in Joe Biden in 2020 got more votes than the people who didn't vote. The biggest participant in terms of who has won an election in the United States has broadly been neither. It has been people not actually voting outside of 2020 for broadly the last 30 years or so. And we've seen that trending downwards across the Anglosphere and across the Western world, but specifically in the Anglosphere for quite a while. We saw the last election in the United Kingdom. We saw our turnout the lowest it's almost ever been since universal suffrage. And I think there's a good fix for this, I think, is mandatory voting, which is what Australians have. We broadly see more people in Australia be more aware of politics too. And I think what we also saw is we saw the Trump administration, or at the very least the Trump campaigners, be very good at tapping into the understanding that people were checked out with politics. And we saw them go on these frat boy podcasts. We've seen Tucker Carlson engage with these people too, insofar as they knew that the apolitical people could be turned political if the things that they engaged with had a political slant to them or had politicians on their shows. That's why we saw people like Donald Trump go on the podcast network. You saw the Note Boys, we saw go on with Theo Von and people like that, because they understood the levels which people weren't concerned with politics. And so a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump who would have had no understanding of what was happening with Iran, what was happening with geopolitics at the time, what was happening in Gaza, just saw him from his podcast appearance and then voted for him in anyway. And it's a problem. It's a big problem for governments if, as was pointed out in one of those statements there, is that they don't feel like the decisions that they make will broadly affect people's understanding of politics if they don't even pay attention themselves, especially not when it comes to geopolitics and foreign policy too. I mean, most people are concerned, as we saw in terms of the polls, with what's happening in their immediate vicinity. If they don't like the current administration, they'll go to the other one purely on the grounds of economic concerns. And whether or not your country is aiding a genocide or not, or whether they are assassinating leaders across the world or destabilizing broader global kind of macroeconomics, will pass them by. It'll totally pass them by. And again, I may be jealous, but it's bad for democracy.
Although, I mean, in America, here, obviously we had really low turnout at that last election. but maybe that was just uniquely because of the options.
I mean, that is true.
I mean, turnout was quite high in 2019. Turnout in America has been increasing. So turnout as a proportion of the eligible population in 1980 was 58%, 1984, 55%, 1988, 52%. The lowest seems to be in 1996, 51%. Last year, 2024, it was 63%. 2020, it was 65%. 2016, 59%. 2012, 58%. 2008, 61%. So
it's kind of oscillating, it does seem, yeah.
Well, no, but it's higher in all of those. Everything since 2000 has been, everything since 2004 has been higher than the 80s. So I think the argument that the problem is disengagement with politics, I don't find it that convincing. I think people are very engaged with politics, but actually when people are very engaged with politics and they're getting all their politics from social media and YouTube.
And TikTok, yeah, Instagram.
It can get quite bizarre, which I suppose is why I'm more sympathetic to people getting drunk on the beach, but I don't know.
I guess that shows that the Trump political strategy of just engaging with media like TikTok and Instagram. We saw it with Mamdani as well, being popular on vertical video, although that helped him campaign on the ground. But whether we will probably not know the data on that one. But it just showed that even in the times of people more likely to vote, their engagement with the issues is lower if we're seeing this level at which people are just voting based upon vibes rather than based upon, whether or not the global economy might get blown up by somebody invading a country because they're being led by the nose by a leader of another country.
My favourite response to that video was the resharing of a 1998 CNN interview with Mohammed Khatami, who was then president of Iran.
Alexis de Tocqueville, who spent some 2 years in the United States in the 19th century and wrote the valuable book entitled Democracy in America, which I am sure most Americans have read.
That's a meme that constantly comes up on Twitter with a picture of Khatami with Alexis de Tocqueville, which I'm sure most Americans have read, vastly overestimating, either vastly overestimating the literariness of Americans or potentially trolling. I mean, maybe he's worldly enough to know that is a troll, that Americans don't actually read Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote Democracy in America. What people have, though, been commenting on since the start of this war, which is very interesting, is quite how educated Iran's leaders seem to be compared to their counterparts in the United States. So significant here, Ali Larijani, who was the head of the Supreme National Security Council until the Israelis killed him. He was a philosophy PhD. He has written multiple books on Kant. And this passage from Haaretz, so the Israeli newspaper, it was actually a profile of him before he died, so it wasn't an obituary. They wrote this profile, then a couple of days later he was killed. But this is what they said about him. Even while serving in government over decades, he has never abandoned what appears to be his greatest passion, philosophy. The cool-headed politician is also a philosopher, a lecturer in the subject at the University of Tehran, and an expert on Kant's views of mathematics and science, who has written no fewer than 6 philosophy books and numerous articles. And then the writer says, or the author, I spent the last week of the war immersed in Larijani's writings, to the extent possible with the Iranian internet largely shut down, with even academic websites and Larijani's personal site blocked. I discovered a brilliant thinker who combines in an unusual way a life of contemplation with a life of action, no small feat. In his writings, Larijani tries to defend the basic premises of his extreme religious worldview using the rules of Western philosophy, and he often advances arguments that are genuinely thought-provoking. So this is an article which is written in Israel, so the country which is at war with Iran. Can you imagine any country which is, at war with the United States having an article which says a similar thing about Donald Trump or anyone in Donald Trump's cabinet? I find that difficult to imagine. Even with Keir Starmer's never written anything thought-provoking, has he? Also, Iran's foreign minister, so Abbas Araghchi, of course, who's still alive, one of the leaders the Americans and Israelis haven't yet killed. He also holds a PhD in political thought. He's from which he got from the University of Kent. The thesis was entitled The Evolution of the Concept of Political Participation in 20th Century Islamic Political Thought. So I think it was sort of a lying democratic theory through the lens of Islam. Sounds very interesting. Apparently people who've read it also say it's a very interesting work. The deceased Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was also always described as literary. So this is from The Economist magazine's obituary of the leader. Again, not a huge fan of the Islamic Republic. So they say, he was a literary boy, and the books he most enjoyed, Uncle Tom's Cabin, The Grapes of Wrath, and especially Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, were about the struggles of the poor. Growing up as he did, with many siblings in a single room and a damp basement, sometimes subsisting on bread and raisins, he knew that story. He enjoyed music too, and his mother quoted the poet Hafiz to him. But he was in Mashdad, a sacred city. His father was a religious scholar, so from 4 years old, he was immersed in Islamic studies, eventually in Qom. So this is their supreme leader, someone who grew up dirt poor, subsisting on bread and raisins in a damp basement, becomes very literary, huge fan of the literary works, music, becomes a religious scholar. Over in America, they have someone who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and apparently can't be bothered to read reports about the war he's currently conducting. So this is a report today from NBC News. Apparently Trump can only be briefed about his war on Iran via short video.
Your new exclusive reporting that President Trump's daily briefings include video montages of the biggest, most successful strikes on Iranian targets. But how is that sort of shaping the broader perception or his perception of this war?
Yeah, so we spoke with a number of different people for the reporting on this story, and we were told that the military every single day creates videos, probably similar to the ones that you're seeing here now, of some of the biggest explosions, some of the biggest strikes that the U.S. is taking against Iran. But some of the people we spoke with were a little concerned that the president is seeing these videos and he's not necessarily getting the other side. So while he's aware of the U.S. military strikes and the U.S. military successes, which candidly have been pretty extensive so far throughout the 4 weeks of this war, he's not necessarily hearing what it is that Iran is still capable of doing. So, for instance, one of the anecdotes that we heard about was when several weeks ago, early on in the war, several U.S. military refueling planes were damaged in a strike from Iran. And the president found out about that from the media. He saw it in the news. He was frustrated by that. When his briefers explained to him what exactly had happened, he took to Truth Social and said, well, you're not telling the good side of the story. You need to be telling what the successes are and not just the failures. And he specifically referenced that. Some of the officials who we spoke with as part of this story are concerned that he's just not hearing enough about, frankly, both sides of this war right now.
Yeah, to really balance that narrative more accurately.
Helena, so just to be clear, the fact that these Iranian leaders have written books and are very learned people, it's a very learned culture, doesn't take away from the fact that they've also repressed protesters and responsible for quite a lot of people's deaths. But it is remarkable how much more educated they are than the Americans who are launching this war. The Americans clearly have power to more, powerful weaponry, have a much larger military, a lot more money to play with. But is it potentially one reason why the Iranians appear to be winning this war against the odds that they're just slightly more intelligent?
There's probably a potential to that. Trump does have a degree, right? It's an economics degree, if I remember correctly, although that was quite a few years ago.
He hasn't written 4 books on Kant, though.
That is also very, very true, and he is indeed having to be briefed in terms of short-form video, and did appoint a bunch of podcasters to important roles in government. So, it's not great.
Nothing wrong with podcasters, but don't put me in charge of a war.
Yeah, no, likewise, me neither. But yeah, there seems to be a gap there. But then again, being educated, having, even going to the most prestigious educational institutions in the world doesn't mean that translates into good governance. Look at Liz Truss. Liz Truss went to Oxford, if I remember correctly. Check that one. I think Liz Truss went to Oxford, and she is quite literally the most humiliated prime minister in the history of the United Kingdom. But I think that there's broadly...
I just remembered, she did go to Oxford, she did PPE, but the person who actually was apparently a really good scholar was Kwasi Kwarteng. So he did a PhD in economic history and apparently wrote a really, I think, a good book on sort of the economics of empire.
Interesting.
I haven't read it, but I think William Dalrymple on the Empire podcast, which I quite like, said it's a fantastic book. So obviously, yes, people who are intelligent, learned people who write thoughtful books can also be idiots in many ways.
That's true.
Sorry, I interrupted your point.
Well, that's fine. I think a point I would make is that engagement with politics is much easier when you're in a powerful, strong country, right? When you don't have to worry about the broader effects of destabilizing your own country because of the size of the economy, how powerful you are, both kind of economically and militarily. It's much easier to be able to make mistakes. We've seen this. I guess I can speak for my own my own understanding of what the British political class are like, they're all very comfortable. They're all people who've been in positions purely on grounds, in a lot of cases, because they know the right people, rather than because there's been some kind of race which has been determined by their aptitude for roles in government. You know, a lot of these people are there because they're apparatchiks, rather than because they have demonstrated an aptitude for governance, shall we say. And I think that probably is at least got a parallel in terms of what's happening in the United States as well, in terms of, you know, like I say, actual factual podcasters or people who've been on Fox News in incredibly important roles in government. So broadly in terms of the way in which people get into politics, whilst I guess you can also say that people get into roles as the Ayatollah purely by hereditary purposes, by a hereditary nature.
I mean, he's a nepo baby, isn't he? The new Mujtaba Khamenei. Didn't necessarily get there by his own merits.
That's true. But on the broader point, I guess, of is the Trump administration full of people who are just dumber than the ones in the Iranian administration? I mean, I've seen what Donald Trump posts on Truth Social. I don't think I'm concerned about being beaten him in a game of chess. Let's be real.
I mean, it seems Obama was intelligent. It seems safe to say that this current White House administration has slightly lower IQ than the people in Tehran at the moment. Let's wrap up. We should go read some Kant. Do a reading group.
Yeah, I should probably get myself read up before I start criticising any politicians and they realise I don't read anything. So.
Helena, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Absolutely, it's an absolute pleasure. We got there. I got here eventually.
Got there in the end, and you'll be hosting tomorrow.
I am hosting tomorrow. Yes.
Thank you everyone for watching. We'll be putting out that interview on Iran's nuclear program later this evening, I imagine. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.